Okay, so let's talk about the inner critic, okay? Um, this is the number one most prominent component that drives each of the core anxiety patterns, right? So we're going to dive in this structure or this part of our psyche, because it's a huge part of what's driving anxiety for all of us, okay? Um, Before I dive into what the inner critic is and how to work with it, I want to make a really big caveat. And this is for anybody who's ever worked with inner critic stuff before. Do not underestimate the inner critic. Okay, I am going to repeat that because it's so important. Do not underestimate the inner critic, especially if you've done a lot of self-help work, done a lot of inner child healing or things like that. Um, in circles where we're doing inner critic work through like coaching or therapy, it's really, really easy to just think that the inner critic is just negative self-talk, right? We go, okay, I can recognize that I'm telling myself something negative, saying something negative about myself, and that's the inner critic, which is true. But the inner critic is way, way deeper than that. It's way more than just negative self-talk. It goes really, really deep in our personality structure and our psyche. So please, please, please don't tune it out if you're here and you see this term and you're like, okay, I've done this before. Not in this way, probably, in the way that we're going to be talking about it. And I say that because that's exactly what I did. And I wish I hadn't because I feel like I could have healed anxiety and understood it much quicker if I had more understanding and actually an openness to see, whoa, how deep the inner critic actually goes. Okay, and we're going to be talking about this throughout the week, but especially on Friday. So if this is something that you struggle with, definitely make sure that you catch Friday's session as well. If you're experiencing anxiety, and I say this to all my students, if you're experiencing anxiety, I guarantee you there's some aspect of the inner critic that's causing it. Okay. So, what actually is the inner critic? And this is the definition I use. Everybody has something a little bit different, but for the most part, the inner critic is the part of our psyche that dictates what's acceptable and not acceptable in our experience in inner life. Okay, so what happens is it's the part of us that watches and polices our behavior. It judges who we are and it tells us how we should be. And because of that, it causes a great deal of anxiety that we experience in our daily lives. So, why do some people have anxiety and why do some people don't, then, right? Well, the inner critic is the internalized messaging that we got from our family, our parents, the culture that we grew up in, the environment. It's almost like the air that we breathed in growing up. And so it kind of all combines and amalgamates into this structure in our psyche that runs automatically in our subconscious. And it will stay in our subconscious until we actively start looking at it and parsing it out. So I don't know if those of you who I just read this quote from like a hypnotist or something like that, who is basically saying that the majority of our behavior is actually dictated by our subconscious. And what I think he really meant by that is that all of the messaging that we've gotten internalized and impacted lives in our subconscious until we can become more aware of it. Okay. So, a lot of people don't realize how aggressive this thing is and how constricting the inner critic is in terms of you can't do this, you can't do that, you need to be this way, you can't be that way. What are other people going to think about you? Okay, so many people that I've worked with over years actually have an extremely aggressive and demeaning inner critic. And unfortunately, a lot of times they don't even recognize that there's criticism from the inner critic going on. They just are so identified with feeling bad, feeling anxious, feeling hurt, feeling small and weak. Meanwhile, they've had this inner critic constantly attacking them and criticizing them and telling them how they're not good enough, right? So what they don't realize is that anxiety is the result a lot of times of the inner critic attacking them. So that's like the first initial layer that we're starting to look at here. When you start looking at the anxiety patterns, just we'll start to work with this, is where do you feel like that anxiety is coming from? What's creating that? And the first, there's many, many layers, by the way, but the first layer is usually the inner critic, right? So just imagine someone who's in your life constantly hanging over your shoulder, sometimes whispering to you, sometimes outright yelling at you, saying, "You're no good. Watch out for that person over there. They might hurt you. You need to be better. Don't be too pushy," right? People don't like that. But don't be too much of a pushover. People don't like that either, right? Be gentle, be soft. Oh, why are you so weak, right? So a lot of times the inner critic, the messaging that we've gotten is often contradictory also, right? So just tune into yourself now as you're listening to this and just see if that's actually happening for you, right? See if these messages are operating you and just what to whatever degree that you're aware of them, right? Even if you don't have any idea where they come from right now, just to see. Okay, so why in the world do we have this structure, right? Why do we have this thing in our heads, in our bodies? Like when you get to the deeper levels, you'll see that the inner critic actually is embedded in the body. It's not just mental thoughts, right? Why do we have this thing? And this is really important to understand is that the inner critic initially is a developmental structure in our psyche to help us appropriately engage in the world. So the inner critic usually develops around the age of 7 or 8 as we're really beginning to separate from our parents and our families to become individual people. And so the inner critic kind of serves as an interim program. It forms as an internalized set of rules to help us know what's appropriate, right? That we're actually socialized, that we're not just going off like running rampant and throwing tantrums everywhere, right? Because at the time we haven't developed a natural conscience yet. And so the inner critic is a stand-in for what's right and wrong. Like my kids aren't quite 7 and 8 yet, but my 6.5-year-old is already starting to sort of be moralistic, right? Like, oh, that's the right thing to do. That's the wrong thing to do, right? And we need that in order to develop. So the example that I like to use is if you plant a young tree, you put stakes around it to help give it structure, right? And the structure helps it grow and not fall over. But when the tree grows and it gets strong enough, it gets its roots established, then it no longer needs those supports. And we can take them off and the tree can continue growing. And so the inner critic is kind of like that. The it provided structure for us in our development. Okay. Um, and what happens for us is that the number one misunderstanding about the inner critic and working with the inner critic is that we just believe these messages to be true. We believe that they came from us. We believe that they're a part of us, even if objectively those messages are untrue, right? And they in fact came from outside of us instead of our own inner knowing. Like it wasn't a natural part of who we were, okay? And because our parents were by no means perfect, what they deemed appropriate versus inappropriate might have been heavily skewed, right? So what we internalize and what the inner critic takes on are all the messages that, some of them are true and they reflect true qualities about who you are and truths about who you are. And others, they weren't true at all, right? They were just perspectives from your parents or beliefs from the environment. So, these are things like you probably hear these a lot in culture from your parents, right? From society. You need to be thinner. You're not smart enough. You're too loud. You're too needy. You need to work harder. You have to make a lot of money or else you're a failure, right? Something bad will happen if you don't do XYZ. So as adults, what happens is that we still carry around this internal programming of the inner critic. And this is part of the patterning. So we end up living our life unconsciously believing that we're still dependent on this sort of set of rules that we had to follow and that we just assumed to be true, or that we at the time couldn't challenge, right? So we learn not to challenge them or else, right? A lot of times we challenge and then we get punished, or we challenge and we get abused, or we challenge and we get hurt some way. So we don't challenge now. Um, and we don't challenge whether these are true or not, because we simply had to take them as truth when we were kids. So the good news is, as adults, we can do the work to challenge any of these messages and find out the truth about ourselves. So that sounds amazing, right? Okay, like let's just start challenging these messages. But this is the big but, is that it's trickier than that. Because for most of us, we've suppressed all of these messages, right? We've suppressed the messages from the inner critic. It's just operating unconsciously now. And it's very strong, so that if we start challenging, it's going to get even more constricted, right? It'll get tighter, um, especially if we're not conscious of it. So this is why I'm never like, I'm not about, I think mindset coaching is really great for certain things, but I'm never about like, let's just like shift our mindset about it, or shift our thinking about it, or like, here's the perspective that you need to look through, right? Because these are specific things that you can do that all day long, but if you don't deal with this structure, it's always going to be there. It's always going to impact you in some way.